5:45 p.m. Eastern Time. That's the exact minute the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps decided to roll the dice again. Multiple ballistic missiles launched from Iranian soil, screaming toward an American base in the Middle East. And within minutes, every single one of them was a smoking piece of scrap metal falling into the desert. 0 for however many they fired. Iran spent months building up to this moment, and it took the United States military less time to shut it down than it took you to watch the first 30 seconds of this video. So let's talk about what actually happened, why Iran was dumb enough to try it again, and what the U.S. response tells us about where this whole thing is headed. Because this wasn't just a missile attack. This was Iran testing whether a pause in the fighting meant weakness. And they got their answer in about 4 minutes flat. And stick with me through this whole video because I'm going to walk you through the timeline, minute by minute, break down exactly what the American response looked like on the ground and in the water, and then get into the strategic picture that most other channels covering this story are completely missing. This is one of those nights where a lot happened very fast, and if you only catch the headline, you miss the part that actually matters. Here's the setup, because context matters here. Just days before this attack, President Trump had ordered a halt to American strikes on Iran. Give diplomacy a shot. Let cooler heads figure this out at the negotiating table instead of over the Persian Gulf. That's a real, genuine attempt to wind this thing down without more bloodshed. And for a few days, it looked like maybe, just maybe, both sides were willing to take the off-ramp. Then Tuesday evening happened. CENTCOM put out the statement almost as soon as the smoke cleared. Their words, not mine. Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces launched multiple ballistic missiles from Iran in an attempted surprise attack on U.S. forces based in the Middle East. And then the sentence that matters most in that entire statement. All Iranian missiles were successfully intercepted. Not most of them. Not several were shot down and we're still assessing the rest. All of them. Every single missile Iran launched at American troops that night ended up doing absolutely nothing except costing Tehran a very expensive fireworks show and confirming once again that American air defense in that region is not something you want to test. Reporting pointed to the target as a U.S. base in Jordan, specifically an installation that hosts a regional American command presence. The Jordanian military put out its own confirmation, saying the incoming missiles were tracked, intercepted, and destroyed before they ever got close to doing damage. No casualties, no structural damage, just a very short, very loud light show over the desert that ended with Iran's missiles turned into confetti. Think about what that base actually represents for a second. This isn't some forward outpost in the middle of nowhere. It's a facility that hosts American command infrastructure for the entire region, the kind of place that coordinates logistics, intelligence, and operational planning across multiple countries. If Iran had actually managed to land even one missile there, we would be having a completely different conversation right now. That's exactly why they picked it. Not because it was an easy target, but because a successful hit, even a partial one, would have been the propaganda win of the entire war for them. And that's precisely why the total failure of this attack stings so much more on their end than a failed strike on some minor forward position would have. Now here's the part that should make you sit up. This was the first time Iran had directly targeted a U.S. base since that pause went into effect just days earlier. Iran had a window, an actual opportunity to step back, let the diplomats do their thing, maybe walk away from this war with something resembling their dignity intact. Instead, the IRGC looked at an open hand extended toward de-escalation and decided the smart move was to load up ballistic missiles and fire them at American troops anyway. Why would they do that? Because from Tehran's perspective, a pause doesn't look like generosity. It looks like an opening. It looks like the moment where they can land one symbolic hit, claim a propaganda victory back home, and test whether the United States actually meant it when it said the fighting was over. They rolled those dice, and they came up empty. Every missile down, nothing gained, everything to lose. And Iran did try to spin it, because of course they did. Their state media outlet put out the claim that the IRGC had struck a U.S. Central Command headquarters facility in the region. That's the story they wanted their own population and the wider world to hear. Meanwhile, the actual result on the ground, independently confirmed by the host country's own military, was 0 missiles landing, 0 damage, 0 American or Allied casualties. So somewhere in Tehran, state television is currently telling their people about a great victory that, in reality, consisted of 5 ballistic missiles getting vaporized in the sky before they did anything at all. Sound familiar? Because it should. This is the same playbook we've seen from this regime over and over throughout this entire conflict. Announce a devastating strike, let state media run wild with the framing, and then quietly hope nobody checks what actually happened on the ground. But we check. That's the whole point of a channel like this. We go through the CENTCOM statements, the on-the-record reporting, the host nation confirmations, and we lay out exactly what took place. without the propaganda varnish on either side. So now let's get into the response. Because Iran firing missiles and missing is one story. What the United States did next is the story that actually matters here. Almost immediately, CENTCOM confirmed that American and Saudi Arabian aircraft carried out precision strikes against multiple targets in eastern Iraq. These weren't random retaliatory potshots. According to the U.S. military's own statement, these strikes hit logistics sites and weapon storage locations tied to Iran-aligned militias, the exact groups that had been launching a wave of drone attacks against American and Allied positions in the days leading up to this. CENTCOM specifically cited more than 30 IRGC-directed aerial drone attacks in the 72 hours before this strike. 30 drone attacks in 3 days. That's not a skirmish, that's a sustained campaign. And it had been building well before that missile launch from Iranian territory ever happened. So when people ask why the American response came so fast, this is why. The U.S. military wasn't reacting only to one missile salvo. It was responding to a pattern, a full 72-hour stretch of Iran-backed militia groups hammering away with drones, testing gaps, probing for weaknesses, trying to bleed American and partner forces through 1,000 small cuts instead of one big obvious move. And then Iran topped it off by launching ballistic missiles directly from its own soil. That combination, the drone barrage plus the direct missile launch, is what triggered a response big enough to make it very clear that this pause in the fighting was not, and never will be, a green light for Iran to escalate. CENTCOM's language afterward was about as blunt as this kind of statement ever gets. The unwarranted attacks against U.S. forces were not successful. Full stop. No hedging, no diplomatic softening. Just a flat statement that Iran tried something and it did not work. And then you had the political response, which honestly tells you just as much as the military one. President Trump, speaking to reporters, made it clear that American forces had only minutes, not hours, to identify and shoot down those incoming missiles. Minutes. Think about how tight that decision window actually is. Radar picks up a launch, systems have to confirm trajectory, confirm it's hostile, confirm it's heading toward personnel, and get an interceptor in the air, all before that missile covers the distance from Iranian launch sites to wherever it's aimed. And in this case, every single interception happened inside that razor-thin window. That's not luck. That's the result of billions of dollars and years of training built into an air defense architecture that was specifically designed for exactly this scenario. Trump didn't hold back on what comes next either. His message was simple. If Iran wants to keep testing this, the response is going to be significant. He made clear that the fragile pause in strikes, the one that had only been in place a matter of days, was now very much in question. And that puts Iran in an extraordinarily difficult spot. They had an off-ramp. They had a president actively signaling a willingness to let diplomacy work. And their answer was to fire ballistic missiles at American troops anyway. Here's something else worth sitting with. This attack happened just hours after a face-to-face meeting at the White House between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, their first in-person meeting since the initial joint strikes against Iran back at the end of February. You don't need me to spell out the timing implications there. Iran watched two of the key architects of the pressure campaign against them sit down together in Washington, and within hours, they launched missiles. Whether that was coordinated retaliation or just Iranian hardliners deciding the timing sent the right message to their own domestic audience, the optics are impossible to ignore. Now, let's zoom out, because this single missile attack doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's one moment inside a much bigger campaign that's been unfolding for months. CENTCOM's own numbers, as of that same week, showed more than 20 U.S. Navy warships actively operating across the Middle East in support of ongoing military missions. 20 warships. That's not a token presence. That's a full-scale, sustained naval commitment designed to keep pressure on Iran from every possible angle, in the air, on the water, and through the economic chokehold of enforcement operations against Iranian shipping. And speaking of that shipping enforcement, the numbers there are just as telling. As of that point in the conflict, American forces had redirected 18 commercial vessels tied to sanctioned or suspicious activity, disabled 2 outright, and boarded 2 more. A few days earlier, that redirected number sat at 12. So in a matter of days, it jumped from 12 to 18. That's not a static blockade sitting still. That's an operation actively expanding its reach week over week, tightening the net around Iran's ability to move oil, move goods, and move money through the water it once assumed it controlled. Think about what that actually means for a regime that depends on oil revenue to keep the lights on, pay its military, and prop up the militias it funds across the region. Every vessel redirected is money that never reaches Tehran. Every ship boarded is a supply chain interrupted. Every disabled vessel is a message sent to every other captain in that shipping lane that the risk of trying to run Iranian-sanctioned cargo through these waters just went up substantially. This is economic pressure married to military pressure, and it's the kind of squeeze that doesn't show up as a single dramatic headline. but compounds day after day until a government simply cannot function the way it used to. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic side, Iran's own deputy foreign minister went on record saying Tehran had no plans for direct negotiations with Washington, even while acknowledging that discussions through Oman as an intermediary were, in his words, progressing step by step. Read between the lines there. Iran doesn't want to be seen publicly negotiating directly with the United States, because that's a domestic political liability for a regime that has spent years telling its own population that America is the enemy incarnate. But quietly, through a third party, the door is still cracked open. That's the position of a government trying to have it both ways, firing missiles for the home audience while keeping a back channel alive, because they know they can't actually sustain a prolonged direct conflict with the world's most capable military. And that tension, that split between the public bravado and the private reality, is exactly what we keep seeing play out attack after attack in this conflict. Iran needs to look strong domestically. Every missile launch, every drone barrage, every defiant statement from state media serves that internal audience. But every single time American and allied forces respond, the actual battlefield outcome undercuts that narrative almost instantly. Missiles intercepted, strikes on militia logistics hit their targets. Ships redirected, oil revenue squeezed. The gap between what Iran claims and what actually happens on the ground keeps widening, and that gap is exactly where a regime starts to lose control of its own narrative, both abroad and at home. It's also worth remembering how we got here in the first place, because none of this happened in isolation. This conflict traces back to the end of February, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated set of strikes against Iranian targets after talks between Washington and Tehran broke down. Since then, we've watched this thing widen out well beyond the two primary combatants. Iranian-aligned strikes have landed, or been attempted, against American and allied positions in Iraq, Jordan, Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE, with air defense crews across the region shooting down waves of drones and missiles on a near-weekly basis. Some of those interceptions came at a cost. Friendly fire incidents, civilian injuries from falling debris, the kind of tragic side effects that come with running an air war over such a densely populated part of the world. But the broader pattern has stayed remarkably consistent from month to month. Iran launches, defenses intercept the overwhelming majority of what's fired, and the political and economic pressure on Tehran keeps climbing regardless of what any single night's headlines say. Before we get to the hardware, let's sit with the propaganda angle for a second longer, because it tells you everything about how this regime operates internally. Iranian state media didn't just report an attack happened. They specifically claimed a hit on a CENTCOM headquarters facility, as if the strike had actually accomplished something. That's not sloppy reporting. That's a deliberate choice by a government that knows its own population doesn't have access to independent verification. They can say whatever they want on state television, and for a huge portion of their audience, that becomes the only version of events they'll ever hear. Meanwhile, the rest of the world can pull up the Jordanian military's own statement, cross-reference it with CENTCOM's timeline, and see the actual outcome laid out in black and white. 0 missiles landed, 0 damage. That gap between the internal narrative and the external reality is not an accident. It's a survival mechanism for a regime that cannot afford to let its own people see how badly these attacks keep failing. Let's talk hardware for a second, because people always want to know how something like a 100% interception rate is even possible. Ballistic missile defense in that region isn't one system, it's a layered network. You've got early warning radar picking up a launch profile the instant it leaves the pad. You've got space-based and ground-based sensors, cross-referencing that trajectory in real time. And then you've got interceptor batteries, whether that's Patriot systems, THAAD, or ship-based Aegis platforms out on those Navy vessels, all networked together so that whichever asset has the best firing solution takes the shot. It's not one lucky soldier flipping a switch. It's an entire architecture of radar, computing power, and interceptors built specifically to make sure that when Iran fires something, that something never actually lands. And that's the technological reality Iran keeps running into. They can build ballistic missiles. They can launch them. What they cannot do, at least not yet, and arguably not for years, is reliably get those missiles through a modern, integrated air defense network protecting a prepared target. Every single time they've tried a direct launch like this one, the result has been the same. Missiles up, missiles down, 0 effect. And yet they keep trying, because the alternative, actually sitting down and accepting the terms being pushed by Washington, is politically unthinkable for a regime whose entire legitimacy is built on posturing as a power capable of standing up to American might. There's also a cost equation here that almost never gets talked about, and it's worth sitting with for a minute. Every ballistic missile Iran launches represents a serious chunk of money. Money that a government under years of sanctions, watching its currency collapse and its economy sputter, is choosing to burn on hardware that has a track record of failing before it ever reaches its target. Meanwhile, the interceptor systems on the other side of that equation, while not cheap themselves, are backed by a defense budget and an industrial base that can sustain this kind of exchange indefinitely. This is not a war of attrition Iran can win through volume. Every launch that fails is a direct transfer of resources away from an economy that desperately needs them elsewhere, toward a military demonstration that accomplishes nothing beyond a headline on state television. This is exactly why you have to separate the two conversations happening at once here. There's the tactical story, missiles fired, missiles intercepted, that resolves itself within minutes. And then there's the strategic story, the one about resources, legitimacy, and survival, that plays out over months and years. The tactical story keeps ending the same way every time. The strategic story is the one actually worth watching, because that's the one determining whether this regime is still standing in anything resembling its current form a year from now. So here's the real question hanging over all of this. Why does Iran keep doing this if it keeps failing? And I think the honest answer is that the IRGC isn't actually trying to win a conventional military exchange with the United States. They know they can't. What they're trying to do is survive politically. Every missile launch, successful or not, gives hardliners inside the regime something to point to. Every attack, even one that accomplishes nothing on the battlefield, becomes a headline on state television framed as resistance, as defiance, as proof the Islamic Republic hasn't been broken. It's not a military strategy. It's a survival strategy for a leadership class that knows the moment it looks weak at home, the pressure from its own population, a population already suffering under sanctions, under a crippled economy, under blackouts and shortages, could become the bigger threat than anything the U.S. military is doing to them from the outside. That's why you see this pattern of provocation, followed by failure, followed by more provocation. It's not that Iran's military planners think firing a handful of ballistic missiles at a heavily defended American base is going to change the strategic picture. It's that the alternative, silence, restraint, quiet acceptance of the pause, looks like surrender to an audience that's been fed decades of rhetoric about never bowing to American pressure. So they fire, they lose, and then they do it again a few weeks later because the political cost of not firing is, in their calculation, higher than the military cost of failing. But here's what should worry Tehran more than anything else happening right now. The trend line on all of this is not moving in their favor. Every week, the naval presence around them grows. Every week, the number of vessels being redirected or boarded climbs. Every week, another round of strikes degrades another piece of the infrastructure that Iran-aligned militias depend on to keep pressuring American and allied positions across Iraq, Jordan, and beyond. This isn't a static standoff. It's a slow grinding campaign that's tightening month over month. And Iran's only visible countermove is launching weapons that get shot down almost as soon as they leave the ground. Now, there's a version of this story where things spiral further, and it's worth being honest about that possibility instead of pretending this is all one-directional. Trump's own comments after this attack made clear that patience is not unlimited. He signaled that if Iran continues testing the boundaries of that pause, the American response would be substantial, not just another round of strikes on militia logistics in Iraq, but potentially a return to direct action against targets inside Iran itself. That's the knife's edge this entire situation is balanced on right now. A pause meant to give diplomacy room to breathe, being actively undermined by a faction inside Iran that either can't or won't restrain itself, and a U.S. administration that has already shown repeatedly that it's willing to escalate hard and fast the moment American forces are directly targeted. And that's really the story underneath the story here. This missile attack wasn't really about Jordan, or even about that one specific base. It was a test. Iran wanted to know whether the pause represented genuine restraint they could exploit, or whether the United States was still fully locked and loaded regardless of what the diplomatic language suggested. They got their answer within minutes, every missile down. Immediate retaliatory strikes on the militia infrastructure feeding the broader campaign against American forces. A president publicly signaling zero tolerance for further escalation. That is about as clear an answer as a government can send without abandoning the diplomatic track entirely. Which brings us to the bigger picture question I think about every time one of these attacks happens. What does Iran actually get out of any of this? Set aside the propaganda value for a second and look at the balance sheet. Every missile fired is a missile that cost real money. Money a government under crushing sanctions and a battered economy can barely justify spending on state television footage of ballistic missiles get intercepted. Every attack invites a response that further degrades the very militia networks Iran depends on to project power without directly risking its own forces. Every provocation extends the naval blockade, tightens the shipping restrictions, and gives Washington more justification to keep that pressure campaign running exactly as it has been. There is no version of this pattern that ends with Iran in a stronger position. Every single data point over these past months points the same direction. A regime running out of good options, responding to that shrinking room to maneuver with actions that make its situation worse, not better. And I think that's the lens you need to watch the rest of this conflict through. Not attack by attack, missile by missile, but as a slow accumulation of pressure that's reshaping the entire balance of power in that region in real time. A pause in the fighting that Iran chose to test within days instead of use to its advantage. A missile attack that failed completely and immediately, triggering a response that hit the exact militia infrastructure Iran depends on. A naval blockade that keeps expanding week after week, redirecting more ships, disabling more vessels, cutting deeper into the revenue Tehran needs just to keep functioning. And a domestic political calculation inside Iran that seems to value the appearance of resistance over the actual outcome of every engagement, even when that appearance costs them more each time it fails. So when you see a headline that says Iran fired missiles at a S-base, don't just read that as an isolated event. Read it as one more data point in a pattern that's been building since the end of February. A regime testing limits it keeps discovering don't exist. A military response from the United States that keeps demonstrating just how thin the gap has become between what Iran launches and what actually survives contact with American and allied defenses. And a political leadership in Washington that has made it unmistakably clear, through both actions and words, that the door to diplomacy stays open. But the moment American forces are directly targeted, that door closes fast, and the response comes even faster. There's one more thread worth pulling on before we wrap this up, and it's the question of what Iran's actual allies are doing while all of this plays out. Because for all the rhetoric about resistance networks and regional partnerships, the militias operating in Iraq that keep launching drones at American positions are increasingly finding their own logistics and weapons depots turned into rubble every time they push too hard. That's not a coincidence. That's the direct consequence of Iran using proxy forces to project pressure without risking its own uniformed personnel, and those proxies absorbing the retaliation instead. Every strike on a logistics site in eastern Iraq is one more hit to the supply chain that keeps those militias functioning, and there's only so many times you can rebuild a weapons cache before the whole network starts to genuinely struggle to operate. Iran gets to claim resistance without direct cost, right up until the moment the cost becomes too obvious to ignore, and if this pace of strikes keeps up, that moment might be closer than anyone in Tehran wants to admit. Here's what I'll be watching over the next few days, and you should be too. Whether Iran attempts anything else while this pause technically remains in place, because that will tell us whether this missile attack was a one-off decision by a hardline faction or the start of a broader pattern of testing American resolve. Whether the back-channel talks through Oman actually produce anything concrete, or whether that's simply Iran buying time while it decides its next move. And whether the blockade numbers keep climbing the way they have been, because that slow economic strangulation might end up being the thing that actually forces a resolution here, long after any single missile attack has been forgotten, because at the end of the day, missiles that get intercepted don't change outcomes. Economic pressure that compounds week after week does. Iran can keep firing all the hardware it wants into the sky over Jordan or anywhere else in that region, and the United States military has shown, repeatedly and consistently, that it has the systems in place to make sure none of it matters militarily. What actually matters is the slower story running underneath all of this. The ships being redirected, the revenue being cut off, the militia networks being degraded, strike by strike, and a regime that's running lower on real options every single week this continues. And it's worth remembering that this back and forth doesn't happen in a vacuum for the rest of the world either. Every escalation, every pause, every failed missile launch ripples out into oil markets, shipping insurance rates, and the broader sense of stability across the Gulf. Traders and analysts watching this conflict aren't just tracking who fired what at whom. They're pricing in the probability of the pause holding, the odds of a wider regional spillover, and the likelihood that shipping lanes stay open for business as usual. That's part of why nights like this one matter well beyond the immediate military outcome. A single failed missile attack can still move markets, shift diplomatic calculations in Washington, Brussels, and Riyadh, and reset the clock on how long anyone expects this pause to actually last. That's where I think this is headed. Not toward some single dramatic turning point, but toward a long, grinding squeeze that keeps getting tighter until something inside Iran finally gives, whether that's the leadership deciding real negotiations are the only path left, or internal pressure from a population that's already exhausted, forcing change from within. Either way, nights like this one, missiles up, missiles down, strikes in response, statements from CENTCOM and the White House, are becoming the rhythm of this conflict. And every single time it plays out the same way, Iran ends up a little weaker than it was before it pulled the trigger. So that's where things stand right now. Iran fired, every missile failed. The United States and its partners answered within hours, hitting the exact infrastructure feeding this entire campaign against American forces. And the broader squeeze, the ships, the sanctions, the naval presence, keeps tightening regardless of what happens on any single night. I'll keep tracking this as it develops, because if the pattern of these past few months holds, this will not be the last time we're talking about a launch from Iran that ends with nothing landing and everything backfiring. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Do you think Iran keeps testing this pause? Or does tonight's failure actually push them toward the negotiating table for real this time? I read every comment, so drop your take down there. And if you want to stay on top of how this keeps developing, make sure you're subscribed, because this story is moving fast and I'll be breaking down every major update as it happens. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.